Okay, so I need to talk about this. Because when the first reaction started coming in for The Devil Wears Prada 2, I was not ready. I genuinely thought this was going to be one of those sequels that nobody asked for, that nobody needed, and that was going to slowly chip away at everything that made the original so special. And then the takes started dropping, and people were saying things like, this has no right to be as good as it is. Critics were saying they didn't expect to cry. Twice, because of Stanley Tucci. Journalists were calling it a documentary on the painful state of their own industry. And one reviewer literally said, and I quote, "If nobody got us, Devil Wears Prada 2 got us." That is not the reaction you expect from a 20-year-later sequel to a fashion comedy. So what is actually going on with this film? Let's get into it. Before we talk about the sequel, we have to acknowledge what the original was, because I think people sometimes forget just how big that film actually was. We're talking about a movie that made $327 million at the global box office in 2006. A movie that gave us one of the most iconic performances of Meryl Streep's entire career, which, given her career, is saying something extraordinary. A movie with a cerulean sweater speech that people are still quoting on the internet almost 2 decades later. The original wasn't just a fashion film. It was a film about ambition, identity, and what you're willing to sacrifice to get where you want to go. It asked a genuinely uncomfortable question. At what point does chasing success stop being inspiring and start being self-destruction? And it wrapped all of that in incredible clothes and sharp, biting dialogue. That's why it became a cultural phenomenon. So when a sequel was announced, the reaction was complicated. Because how do you follow something like that? How do you bring back Miranda Priestly, one of the most perfectly crafted screen characters of the 21st century, without diminishing her? And here's the thing that made this even more interesting. Both Meryl Streep and Hathaway publicly held off on doing a sequel for years. They weren't just being difficult. They were being protective. They didn't want to tarnish something they'd worked so hard to build. So the fact that they eventually said yes, that they got the whole original band back together, including director David Frankel and writer Aline Brosh McKenna, tells you something. Something convinced them this story was worth telling again. Now let's talk about what critics are actually saying, because the early reactions are genuinely fascinating to read through. The most consistent thing you'll see across basically every positive review is that the cast slips back into these roles like they never left. Variety's Jazz Tankay called the film phenomenal and said the script is so sharp and witty that we'll be quoting it for years. Matt Neglia from Next Best Picture said it's hard to imagine any fan of the first film being disappointed, that it's funny, charming, and filled with genuinely heartwarming payoffs. And then there's the Eric Anderson reaction that stuck with me most, which was, The Devil Wears Prada 2 has no right to be as good as it is, which is such a specific and honest way to put it. It's the reaction of someone who walked in with low expectations and got completely proven wrong. The new additions to the cast are being praised too. Kenneth Branagh is in this as Miranda's new husband. Justin Theroux plays Emily's boyfriend. Simone Ashley has a significant new role. Lucy Liu is here. And then there's Lady Gaga, who not only shows up for a cameo, but also co-wrote and performed an original song called Runway with Doekiai, which by all accounts absolutely goes off. The soundtrack is getting serious love across the board. And honestly, when you have Gaga, Doekiai, SZA, and Lao Fei all on the same playlist, that checks out. But here's the part I want to spend real time on, because this is what separates this film from being just a fun nostalgia trip. The journalism angle. Almost every single person who's seen this film has brought it up, and some of them sound genuinely shaken by it. The setup of the sequel is this. Andy Sachs, who left Runway at the end of the first film to pursue actual journalism, is now a serious journalist. But a series of events brings her back to Runway, this time as a features editor. And Runway itself is struggling. The magazine is trying to survive in a world that has completely changed around it. TikTok, AI fashion trends, declining print advertising, the death of legacy media. Miranda Priestly, a woman who has always been the undisputed queen of her world, is now being forced to chase relevance. And that is a devastating thing to watch if you think about what Miranda represents. Meanwhile, Emily Charlton, who spent the entire first film as Miranda's imperious first assistant, looking down on Andy with barely concealed contempt, has completely flipped the power dynamic. She's now a senior executive at a luxury conglomerate. She has the advertising money that Runway desperately needs, which means Miranda, for possibly the first time in her life, needs something from someone who used to work for her. That is such an elegant story engine. The original film was about power being wielded downward. This one is about what happens when that power structure collapses. And critics who work in media have been particularly struck by how accurate and specific the film gets. One reviewer called it a biting media parody wrapped up in high fashion, and said every journalist who sees it will cringe from recognition. Another said it felt like a genuine documentary on the painful state of journalism, and was glad that a mainstream summer blockbuster was willing to unfold around that reality. One journalist put it incredibly well when they said the film is a satirical reflection of the rapid, deteriorating state of modern media, where publications are trying to survive at the hands of, and I'm paraphrasing here, visionless tech bro owners who don't understand or care about the culture that was built there. That is a very real and very current conversation. Newsrooms are being gutted. Magazines that shaped entire generations of readers are shutting down or pivoting to video or being swallowed by private equity. The people who spent their careers building something meaningful are watching it be dismantled by people who see it only as a line item on a spreadsheet. And here's this film, a 20th Century Studios summer movie, not some indie prestige drama, putting that conversation front and center. That's genuinely surprising, and it's clearly resonating. Now I do want to be fair because not everyone is in full love mode with this film. There's some more measured reactions out there, and they're worth taking seriously. The main criticism from the less enthusiastic crowd is that the narrative feels a little loose. One reviewer said it felt like a series of thinly connected story beats, that the film works more as an experience than as a tightly constructed story. Another said that while the journalism commentary is well-intentioned and appreciated, it doesn't land with the same precision as the original film's more personal character drama did. And there's a very honest take that went something like, "It's enjoyable. You can't help loving seeing these characters again. But is it worth the 20-year wait?" That's a legitimate question, and I think it points to something real. Part of what made the original so potent was that it was about something universal. Anyone who's ever compromised their values for a job, anyone who's ever wondered whether the version of themselves they were becoming was someone they actually wanted to be, that film spoke to you. The sequel is about something more specific. The death of an industry. The collapse of institutional media. That's a real and important subject, but it's also a narrower one. It's going to hit differently depending on who you are and what you care about. And this brings me to something I keep thinking about. Why did this film get made now? Why did Streep and Hathaway finally say yes? I don't think it was just about a paycheck or nostalgia. I think the timing is intentional in a way that goes deeper than the surface story. We are living through an extraordinary moment for the media industry. Publications that have existed for decades are closing. Journalists who built their careers are losing their jobs. The entire ecosystem of how we get information, how culture is covered, how taste is shaped and shared, it's all being destabilized at the same time. And into that moment comes a film about a fashion magazine fighting for its survival, anchored by characters that people genuinely love. That's not an accident. That's a choice. There's also something worth noting about where Meryl Streep is in her career right now. Miranda Priestley was already one of her great performances. But revisiting that character with 20 more years of life experience, revisiting her from a position of being further along in your own life and career potentially gives that character new dimensions. A Miranda who is no longer untouchable. A Miranda who is having to adapt. That is so much more interesting than a Miranda who is simply perfectly in control. The vulnerability implied in that premise, for a character whose entire power was built on appearing invulnerable, could be genuinely extraordinary in Streep's hands. That let's also talk honestly about the nostalgia factor, because I think it's both the film's greatest asset and its most complicated element. There is clearly enormous love for these characters and this world. The trailer became the most viewed comedy trailer in 15 years. The first full trailer broke records for the studio. When Streep and Hathaway were filming on the streets of New York, they needed police barriers and crowd control. Fans showed up on buses. Streep said she was genuinely unnerved by it. That level of cultural attachment is powerful. And for a lot of viewers, that warmth, the simple joy of being back in this world with these people, is going to carry the film entirely on its own. There's nothing wrong with that. Movies are allowed to make you feel good. But the more interesting question is whether the film has earned that feeling or is just leveraging it. And from what the critics are saying, it sounds like the answer is mostly earned. The characters have grown. The world has changed around them in ways that feel true. The script is apparently doing real work, not just relying on callbacks and winks of the camera. Though I do want to say, the fact that the return of the word runway apparently got audible reactions in screenings tells you everything about where the audience's heart is. Sometimes pure joy is its own kind of cinema. So here's where I land on all of this. The Devil Wears Prada 2 was never going to be for everyone. No sequel to a film this beloved ever is. The people who found the original shallow will find the sequel shallow. The people who think nostalgia is a cheap trick will see it as a cheap trick. But for people who genuinely love the first film, who carry those characters in their heads, who think about what Andy Sachs became after she walked away from Runway, it sounds like this sequel is doing something real. It's not just cashing in on goodwill. It's using the platform that goodwill provides to say something about the world we're actually living in, about what happens to the things we built when the economics shift under them, about what it means to fight for something that matters when the people holding the checkbook have decided it doesn't. And honestly, in a summer movie landscape that too often plays it completely safe, a film that dresses itself in haute couture and uses that cover to talk about the collapse of journalism, I kind of respect that move. Miranda Priestley would probably say it's the only interesting thing anyone's done all year. The film opens May 1st. If you've ever loved this world, I think you'll want to be there.